Hi everyone, welcome to part 3 of the Civil War. Our questions to think about: why did President Lincoln issue the Emancipation Proclamation? What were the limitations of the Emancipation Proclamation? And how did the Civil War end? I want to start with some terminology here around the issue of emancipation. The outbreak of the Civil War disrupted everyday life, but as the war grew in scope and duration, enslaved African Americans took advantage of the turmoil created by the war to run away, to engage in sabotage, to join the Union war effort, or simply to pursue their own interests. I'm calling this the agency of emancipation because it seems to be a common misunderstanding that slaves simply waited around until the official proclamation of emancipation by Abraham Lincoln and the federal government to free them. But slaves very much took matters into their own hands and acted instead of waiting to be acted upon. So when we take a look at the definition of the word agency, it means active operation. So this makes sense when we think about the ways in which modern historians use the term. So I've given you a visual representation of this through some sculpture here. On the left, you have a monument called the Emancipation Monument by Thomas Ball. And what you see here is a very passive story that the slaves received their freedom from Abraham Lincoln. And we often emphasize this as the story of emancipation, that the slaves were freed. But in the second piece of statuary here by John Quincy Adams Ward called The Freedman, it shows a much more autonomous or more agency on the part of the slave. Now, we don't know who broke his shackles. We just see the broken shackle hanging from his wrist. But what we do notice is that his right hand is on that tree stump, and it looks like he's about to push himself into a standing position. And that's a representation of agency, that no one else is freeing this man, that he is freeing himself. And I want to emphasize this because part of the reason that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by President Lincoln is that so many slaves have taken it upon themselves to free themselves that it becomes a necessity. So taking a look at President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. When Abraham Lincoln ordered the movement of the United States Army against the Southern states, his paramount goal was to preserve the Union. Again, he believes that secession is not legal, and so he wants to protect the United States by preventing Southerners from forming their own independent nation. And like many Northerners, he believes that it is first and foremost important to end the secession movement than to end slavery. But the course of the war is going to change President Lincoln's outlook. During 1862, President Lincoln decided that the emancipation of the slaves in the Confederate States was necessary to win the war. Moreover, sagging morale in the North needed the boost of a moral cause. In other words, if we are fighting this war to prevent secession, that means when the war is over, we're going to go back to the way things were, which means slavery is still legal. And so by making this an effort to free the slaves, then it gives this fight a moral cause. Additionally, proclaiming a war on slavery would forever end any chance that France or Britain would ever support the Confederacy. And so when Abraham Lincoln presented this idea to his cabinet, he said that, quote, decisive and extreme measures must be adopted, and that emancipation was, quote, a military necessity, absolutely necessary to the preservation of the Union. We must free the slaves or be ourselves subdued. So President Lincoln's cabinet encouraged him to wait until a Northern victory on the battlefield in order to prevent the look that this was an act of desperation on the part of the American government. So after the Battle of Antietam in Maryland, the Emancipation Proclamation would go into effect January 1st, 1863. But it's important to understand the limitations of the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation only applied to those areas still rebelling against the United States. The Union-controlled parts of Virginia and Louisiana, along with Tennessee, were exempted. This is a very important thing to understand with the Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln, when you read the document as part of your journal, he very clearly is using his power as the commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy. And within that realm, he is arguing that in these areas rebelling against the authority of the United States, he has this military power to free the slaves there. But Missouri is not rebelling. And therefore, Abraham Lincoln firmly believes that he doesn't have the power to free the slaves in Missouri or Kentucky or Maryland or Delaware or even West Virginia. So Abraham Lincoln argues that it's only in those places that are actively rebelling against the authority of the United States that he has the power to free the slaves. Because if we take a look at the Constitution, there are various portions of the Constitution that talk specifically about slavery. And so the implication here is that slavery is protected by the Constitution. And if we want to do away with slavery, we need a constitutional amendment to do that. And the President of the United States doesn't have the authority or the power to change the Constitution himself. So the Emancipation Proclamation frees some of the slaves, those residing in areas rebelling against the United States. For the rest of the slaves, they have to wait until the 13th Amendment formally changes the Constitution and officially abolishes slavery. As we take a look at the battles leading us into the end of the Civil War, one of the most important focal points here is going to be along the Mississippi River. Early on in the war, the U.S. Navy takes control of New Orleans and secures the mouth of the Mississippi River. And then early on, we also talked about the U.S. Army moving from Ohio into Kentucky and then into Tennessee. And so they've gained control of the northern portion of the Mississippi River. But the middle part of the river is still essentially under Confederate control. And they have this strong point at Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg sits right on the Mississippi River, and every time the United States Navy is trying to move its gunboats into this area, they're fired upon at Vicksburg. So it's important for the Union Army to gain control of this strategic point. So General Ulysses S. Grant is first going to take the capital of Mississippi at Jackson, and then from there move his troops towards Vicksburg. And he ends up setting up a siege of the city of Vicksburg with about 30,000 Confederate troops trapped within the city. So they're bombarding the city and preventing it from being resupplied from the outside. And as the siege of Vicksburg continues, the Confederates are desperate for food. And so they first ate their horses and mules, and then cats and dogs, and then finally the rats. The Confederate leadership is trying to find a way to lure General Grant's army away from Vicksburg so that the city and the troops inside can be resupplied. But instead, Robert E. Lee has another idea. He is still looking to win a major battle on northern soil, not just in the hopes of saving Vicksburg, but also in persuading the northern public to end the war. Neither side chooses Gettysburg, Pennsylvania as the site of a major battle, but the Confederate troops had entered the city in search of shoes and had encountered units of the Union cavalry on June 30th, 1863. Over the next couple of days, the two sides fought to gain control of the hills around the town and to dislodge the enemy. The final Confederate assault at the Union Center at Cemetery Ridge failed. And so on July 4th, 1863, Confederate General Robert E. Lee's mangled army, with about 1/3 of its number gone, begin the slow slog south through the driving rain. On that very same July 4th, 1863, the Confederate commander at Vicksburg, Mississippi, surrendered his entire garrison after the 47-day siege. And now the Union Army controls the entire length of the Mississippi River, and the Confederacy is split in two. After the fighting at Gettysburg had ended, a group of northern states funded a military cemetery for the roughly 6,000 soldiers killed in the battle. And on November 19th, 1863, the new cemetery was officially dedicated. And this is where President Abraham Lincoln gives his famed Gettysburg Address. The dramatic Union victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg helped turn the tide against the Confederacy. The man pictured here is General Ulysses S. Grant, and he hopes to force General Lee's army in Virginia into a climactic single battle. But General Lee's evasive skills forced the Union commander to adopt a policy of aggressive tradition. Let me explain this for a moment. When the two armies would engage, one of them would end up retreating, and there would be a moment of rest, resupply, repositioning, and then the armies would engage again. But what General Grant is going to do is every time General Lee's army retreats, he's going to rush and hit them again. And so he's not giving the Confederate army the opportunity to rest, and he's wearing down the enemy to the point of collapse. The other thing that General Grant is going to do is engage in total war. And what this means is that you're destroying the enemy's ability to wage war. So you're not just attacking their army, but you're attacking their supplies. You're also putting pressure on the civilian population not to support the their army. So I put a little asterisk next to this because General Grant is going to employ the strategy of total war, but General Sherman is going to use it much better. General William Tecumseh Sherman had moved south from Tennessee toward the railroad hub of Atlanta with about 90,000 men against the Confederates' 60,000. General Sherman first resorts to a siege of the city of Atlanta, but when Confederate General Hood is forced to evacuate Atlanta on September 1st, General Sherman enters the city and orders Atlanta's roughly 20,000 residents to leave. He then proceeds to burn Atlanta to the ground. But General Sherman's not done yet. He is going to begin his famous March to the Sea. So from Atlanta, General Sherman is basically going to abandon his supply lines and feed his troops off the land. Anything that the Union Army can't use or take with them, they completely destroy so that the Confederate Army can't use them. So they cut down telegraph wires, they tore up railroads, they burned hay fields and plantations and farms. Anything they couldn't use, they destroyed. General Sherman's army on this famed march to the sea is going to leave a 60-mile wide swath of destruction from Atlanta to the port city of Savannah. More than any other Civil War general, Sherman recognized the connection among the South's economy, its morale, and its ability to wage war. As Sherman put it, quote, "We are not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people who must be made to feel the hard hand of war." On April 2nd, 1865, General Lee's army, with its supply lines having been cut, abandoned the city of Richmond in a desperate flight to the southwest towards the railroads leading south. But once again, General Lee's army is trapped by General Grant. And so on April 9th, 1865, General Lee formally surrenders to General Grant at a place called APPOMATTOX Courthouse. It's not a courthouse, it's the name of the town. So with essentially the surrender of the main body of the Confederate Army, the Civil War is for the most part over. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 750,000 Americans died in the Civil War that had lasted 4 years. But to make matters worse, just 5 days after Lee surrendered to Grant, President Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. And so now the challenge is going to be to reunite the sections, to rebuild the South, and to incorporate the nearly 4 million newly freed slaves into American society and culture. So coming back to our questions to think about, why did President Abraham Lincoln issue the Emancipation Proclamation? Abraham Lincoln called this a military necessity. He is using his authority as the commander-in-chief to free the slaves, these assets in the southern states during 1863. And then what were the limitations of the Emancipation Proclamation is that it only freed the slaves in the areas still rebelling against the authority of the United States government. So slaves in Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, those slaves are not freed until the 13th Amendment. And then how does the Civil War end? With the victory at Vicksburg, the United States Navy controls the entire length of the Mississippi River. With their victory at Gettysburg, the Confederates have to give up any thought of really winning this war. And then when General Grant runs down General Lee's army, it's all over at Appomattox in April of 1865.